So the typical first place to start when you're learning how to stamp in your card making is just stamping and coloring images. Now these are exactly the same image. This one is colored in with dye-based markers. This one is colored in with alcohol-based markers. So I've got some Tombow markers here, which are a dye base. I've got Copic markers here, which are an alcohol base. Now, Copic markers are my favorite way to color because you can get some beautiful blending with them. You can work the paper and it's not going to start pilling, but there's a learning curve to working with Copic markers. And the dye-based markers, the Tombow markers, they're similar to what we grew up with, the markers that we used in school. So most people start there because there's something familiar and they don't need to learn how to blend like you do with Copic markers. But I'm going to show you both here. Now, I don't have a piece of paper here that's big enough for the whole card, just because I want to scratch on the side and want to be free to, I'm not making a card front basically. I'm showing you how to color it. It's going to be exactly the same as if you had a piece of paper big enough for the card front, but I'm just doing them on smaller pieces of paper because I don't plan on using these afterwards. So I have my Memento ink, which is the water resistant ink. It's a dye ink. I need to use that with the Copic markers. I can't use my permanent ink with the Copic markers because they react, and the alcohol ink in the markers will make the stays on run. So these two are not a good combination. These two are. The Tombow markers, I can use either or for this because this is a water resistant ink. It takes a lot before water or moisture makes it blend or smear, and because my drawing is quite fine, even if it does smear a little bit, you're probably not going to see it. If I'm using a bigger surface or watercoloring, I will use stays on because I want to make sure that my ink doesn't run. So I've got my stamp on my block. Like I said, it just clings to the block like a Post-it note. You should do that before you put ink on the stamp so you don't get ink on your fingers. I'm going to tap it in the ink, and then I'm going to position it where I want and then press down firmly. And I tend to rock just slightly, and I'm going to stamp both of them at the same time. This particular image has the stems and the flowers separately, and I obviously didn't clean it after the last time I used it. I used it with permanent ink and never cleaned it off, so I haven't I'm not very good at cleaning my stamps sometimes, especially if it's permanent ink and it's not going to affect anything. So now I'm going to stamp the stem. Now I'm going to eyeball it. If you're concerned with exact placement, you can use either the position it or the stamp platform. But for this, there is a tiny little bit of overlap there, but for what we're doing, it doesn't matter. Even on the front of the card, I just eyeballed it. I didn't bother using the positioning tools for it. So for the dye-based markers, we'll do that first. Now the reason why Copic markers are my favorite as opposed to dye markers is with dye markers, you have to color fairly quickly because already, I'm not sure if you can actually see it, already the paper is pilling and lifting, almost like lint and fuzz on clothing. So you have to work fairly quickly with them, and you don't really have a lot of time to just blend and play with your markers because it starts to affect the paper. For an image like this, because the spaces are fairly small, it would probably be fine if the paper started pilling. Parts of it, especially the center of the flower, would just add a little bit of texture to the flower. So I'm just gonna go and I'm just kind of flicking the color from the center out. I only want the color on the center part. And really for flowers, it's whatever you want because, I mean, there's so many different colors they come in, as well as the fact that sometimes they're dark on the outside, sometimes they're dark on the inside. If it's a flower that is all one color, the darkness tends to be on the towards the inside of the flower where the shadows are. So I only used one brown for my center of the flower there. And then I'm going to use the green to do the leaves. And I'll typically for this, I'll do a lighter and a darker color. The darker color just adds a little bit of interest, a little bit of shading. You don't need to. I could have colored it all one plain color and it would have been just fine. But sometimes adding that second color just adds a little bit more interest to it. Now, when it comes to coloring with the Copics, here, I'll start with the center of the flower. So there's a little bit of technique to it. I'm showing you the basic coloring. I do have a class just based on Copic markers that if this is something you're interested in, I highly recommend it because it just goes into further depth with different techniques you can do. So the basic way of coloring with Copics is start with the light color, then put the darker color in the shadows, and then go back with the lighter. I'm gonna do the green. So when you're starting out with Copics, typically you start out with 2 colors. So you start with the lighter color, and you can tell, you might be able to tell on here, I'm not sure. I'm not being super careful with the lines. If you look really closely, I do go a little bit out of the lines, but that's also because I'm trying to be speedy while I'm coloring, and I'm also talking, which means I'm not totally paying attention to perfection here. But the basic coloring with 2 markers is light and then dark, and then go back over with the light to blend it out. It takes a few minutes for the ink to dry, and the ink continues to blend while it's drying. When you get a little bit more into, when you get to the intermediate area of coloring with Copic markers, you're going to use 3 colors. So I'm going first in with my light color, then I go in with my medium color, especially where petals go beneath or behind each other. That's where there would be a shadow. Before I forget to mention it, the nice thing about Copic markers is you can get refills and you can refill the markers. So when your markers dry out, you simply refill them, as opposed to the Tombow markers. You can't refill them, you need to throw them out, and you need to buy new ones once you've run out of ink. The other thing is the tips are a lot higher quality on the Copic markers, and they tend to last a lot longer. But if by chance you have a tip go funny, you can get replacement tips. So even if you have a tip that goes weird, and I've had my Copics for about 15 years and I've only had to replace maybe a half a dozen of them. But if you have one that goes weird, you can just get a new tip for it. You don't have to throw out the whole marker, whereas the Tombow markers, again, you can't replace the tip, so you need to toss the entire thing out if by chance it goes weird. Oh, before I forget, so the Copic markers, I could sit here for hours if I wanted, and go back and forth, and that paper never starts to break down and pill. I'm not sure if you can see it right on here, but yeah, that paper, I've used them for years. The paper never starts to pill, but the dye-based one, it starts to pill quite quickly, so you have to be a little bit careful or more careful with that. And with the Copic markers, with the blending, you take a little bit more time. The one thing to keep in mind though is because as you're working them, you're adding more and more ink, it does tend to go out a little bit. So you do want to be adjusting your coloring so that your ink doesn't go past the lines. And like I said, it's a learning curve, but it's definitely a learning curve that's possible. And to me, I just like the blending that I can get with the Copics more than you can get with the Tombow markers. And I can go back. I'm gonna wait for this to dry, and I can go back and continue to work those flowers, because some of the darker color went a little bit past where I want it to go, but that's what it looks like when it's completely dry. So we'll see you in the next video, and we're going to do some embossing.